Okay. Good morning to everyone. Welcome to History Matters. And of course, so does coffee. It really matters once the school year starts. Today, we're going to be talking about the Union and different ways to think about the Union, because I think we assume a lot of things about it that we probably shouldn't assume. But before I launch into that topic, I am going to turn to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for being here. We have the rules of the game are as follows. Please make sure to use chat. We enjoy your conversations, and we encourage you to converse with one another and enjoy each other's company during this wonderful time that we have together. We do ask that you keep it germane to the conversation as much as possible, and of course, family friendly. If you do have questions, make sure you put them in Q&A. We had great questions last couple of weeks, so please continue that trend. You put those in Q&A because it's a lot easier for me to keep track of them. That way I don't miss any important questions that you have that may have come through chat. And as always, if you like what we're doing here at the National Council of History Education, please join us. We are pleased to have you join, check out our website at www.ncheteach.org. Sounds like it's functional-ish today, which is always fun. But please do look around. We're adding new content, including we were able to finally accept open registrations for our first two colloquia of 2022. So in January, we are partnering with the Astronauts Memorial Foundation at Cape Canaveral and doing a 3-day colloquia on the space race, which we're really excited about. We're going to have some cool activities for that. And then also the second one is also open, which is President's Day weekend, right before President's Day weekend. And that is in Nashville, Tennessee. And that one is called Finding Americana, which is all about technology's impact on Americana in the music industry, which we're really looking forward to as well. And as always, if you do like what we do, please become a member. You'll get lots of great content, including our History Matters newsletter, which is coming out on next Tuesday. So looking forward to a lot of great stuff. With that, I'll turn it over to Joanne, and thank you, everybody, for being here today.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. Okay, so I want to talk about the Union. And I know that every week I come on here, and in one way or another, maybe not every week, but close, and I say words matter, right? When words matter. And I am going to talk by the end, I'm going to circle back to the fact that words matter. But what I'm going to start by doing is a little bit contradictory. And what I'm going to do is to ask us to not think about the word union as just a word, but to actually think about what it means, because it's meant different things over time. And I think that's important. I think that for a whole variety of reasons, Americans either don't use the word union or think of the word union, or if they use it or think about it, they just sort of take it for granted, like union equals United States. Yeah, okay, that's it. And that hasn't always been the case. And the fact of the matter is, and some of what I'm going to be talking about today is that beginning with the beginning of the Union and continuing for quite some time, certainly through the Civil War, union wasn't so much a thing as an act. So union was the act of joining together. When people talked about the Union, that's what they meant. They weren't talking about some abstract political entity. The Union was the joining together of states, and it was an act that could be undone. So it wasn't something that was assumed to be the case, like, you know, the furniture in the room. It was something that was seen as a choice. It could be unchosen. People could move out of the Union. And it was grounded more than anything else on basically a kind of pact. In a sense, you could say that the Constitution is that pact for the states to join together, engage in the same political system, and I talk about this in my last book, have faith in the system and fight fairly, right? So that everyone in the union feels that they're in the union on equal terms. So union was a problematic word, and it came to have different shadings and different meanings over time. So that's what I want to talk about, particularly nowadays, when, and I'll at the end sort of circle vaguely, briefly, into Civil War, since as I said on Twitter just before coming on here, don't do what I did this morning, which is go on Google and Google, is America about to have a civil war? I don't remember my exact wording. I was just like, wonder what happens when I do that. Yeah, don't. And because a lot of what I think there is not right, but I'm going to come back to that. Okay, so I want to sort of track union and what it means and what that says about how people understood the United States. Now, obviously, at the beginning, union was not taken for granted, and for a time, you know, you can talk about what kind of a union a confederation is. It is a kind of union, but it is a far more decentralized union than our national union under the Constitution, which really does require the joining together into one state, as opposed to a confederation, which joins in common purpose individual sort of state nations. So our national government, in a sense, is a more of a union because it's more of a joining. And I've used before, I know I've used it, I must have mentioned it at least twice, probably more. It's the first document that I used when I did the first History Matters 1,000 years ago, or 78. This is a 78th episode. I remembered, I always forget that. So 78 episodes ago, when I did the first one of these, it was based on this document. I've used it before. It's by Alexander Hamilton. He writes it shortly after the Constitutional Convention. It's a very lawyerly document. He is just sitting down to sort of figure out what he thinks will happen next. And he writes down, okay, if Washington becomes president, these things will happen. But on the other hand, it's possible these things will happen. And he depicts this sort of apocalyptic description of states turning against each other, and or foreign nations sweeping in and taking over parts of the nation. What he's talking about in one way or another in that document is the dissolving of the union, or disunion. And what he says at the end of that document, which is why I like to use it, because it's right after the Constitutional Convention, and it's being written by a person who fought for a constitutional convention forever. And in this document, he concludes by saying, yeah, I think that's probably going to be the outcome, meaning disunion, right? The collapse of the union, the collapse of the nation, that it won't hold together as a single unit, which is striking, but again, gets at one of the points I'm going to be making this morning, which is to think hard about what people mean when they say union. To Hamilton, I think really it was a sort of agreement or act. And in that sense, people could just disagree and move out. It was not an it yet. It was an act. And throughout the 1790s, there was that same sense of the union, and they were talking about the union and using that word at the time as something that was fragile, that might not hold together, easily threatened. And that's a sentiment, we'll see it sort of evolve over time. But that idea that the union is new, that it's fragile, that it's grounded on this sort of unspoken agreements between states to sort of join together under a common pact and cooperate with each other. And that's what makes the union, that when you phrase it that way, it sounds very fragile, and it should, because that's how they understood it at the time. Hamilton, and I should say, secession, fear of secession is not something, and this makes perfect sense given how I'm describing union here. Fear of secession is not something that came along with the Civil War. There was murmuring about secession, not just in Hamilton's private lawyerly memo, but generally speaking, there was murmuring about secession. For example, in 1804, the year that Hamilton dies, there was murmuring that New England was unhappy, that they were unhappy under Jefferson, and that they, might want to secede from the Union. They didn't, nothing happened, but there was talk. And so Hamilton, I believe this is his last letter before the duel. I'm just going to read you 2 sentences because Newby, thank you, Newby, he really, really likes this letter. I don't know. It's the last letter he writes before the duel. And it just shows you the last thing he's thinking about is the Union. So although he calls it our empire, he means Union. He says, I will here express but one sentiment, which is that dismemberment of our empire will be a clear sacrifice of great positive advantages without any counterbalancing good, administering no relief to our real disease, which is democracy, the poison of which by a subdivision will only be the more concentrated in each part and consequently the more virulent. Now, for a whole bunch of reasons, that's a really interesting letter. It might be interesting to do an episode to look at people's last letters. Jefferson also has a really interesting last letter. And if Newby had hands and could write, he would have one too. Unfortunately, he doesn't. But you can see how this idea of the Union as being something you certainly don't take for granted and something that people can just decide their way out of easily is consistent at this time. Now, in the most recent book that I wrote, The Field of Blood, violence, physical violence in Congress, there's an individual at the center of it from New Hampshire. He's a clerk. And one of the things that's consistent in his diary is he's worried about the Union. He's worried about the Union. He gets to Washington in, I believe, 1833. He's worried about the Union. And he worries about the Union from 1833 until the Civil War. It alters over time, but he's constantly worried about it. Initially, because he understands that it's an agreement that can be, there could be a lack of agreement and perhaps it'll go away. He sees political parties as the glue, right? He's like, well, there's stuff going on and there's the South and slavery and that might really take us apart. Newbie. He actually stopped and looked at me. So, slavery as an issue, it is one of several issues. He sees parties as a glue holding things together. Slavery is a Southern issue. French, Benjamin Brown French, this guy at the center of my book, is what would have been known as a dough-faced Democrat, meaning he's really trying to appease the South and slaveholders to hold the Democratic Party together and to hold the Union together. At the beginning of his time in Washington, and he was from this little rural town in New Hampshire, so Washington is a city and it's also this weird national place. He describes the Union as, and these are his words, the glorious whole of glorious parts, which is a great way of putting up, Newbie is like throwing me off here, man. A great way of putting his conception of the Union, the glorious whole of glorious parts, because the parts are important in this Union. Now, clearly, if the Union is that, in a sense, abstract and has to do with agreement and sentiment and a sort of faith in the working of the system, it's fragile. And one of the things that can operate against it is emotion. Right? You can get angry and sort of fight your way out of that agreement. You can decide that other parts of the pact, other states in the Union, are not behaving fairly, are being abusive, are putting themselves over the whole. There are any number of reasons why you can feel that somehow in one way or another, the Union, you are not being treated fairly in that Union, which relies, all of those glorious parts are supposed to be equal members of that Union. So a really interesting quote I found this morning, and of course, this is from 1850 when they're really thinking about the Union. It's actually a Texas congressman named Volney Howard. And he says in 1850, if the Union is ever dissolved, it would be done not by calculation, but quote, as a matter of feeling. Right? What will tear this Union apart will not be people calculating their way out of it. It will be feeling, it will be anger, it will be outrage, it will be fear, it will be emotion that will drive people to lose faith in that pact and to step out of the Union, work for disunion, which is another way of saying what I'm sort of saying in one way or another over and over again, which is the Union as an act. So it's an example. That statement is an example of something I write about in the book, and that I think, again, is worth thinking about when you realize that the Union isn't some calculated political it that just sort of sits there. Breaking apart the Union is a long process, is a painful process. It's something that takes time. It's something that has a personal dimension to it. It's something that has emotion worked into it. It's the breaking of habits. It's the rise of resentments. It's the altering of assumptions. All of those things are part of the breaking apart of a union, because it's a frame of mind more than anything else. And so to abandon that in the sense of union at this time feels like a dramatic personal act. Now, let's see where I'm wanting to go here, because I don't want to go where I thought I was going to go. Okay, this is where I want to go. So, given what I just said, that the Union feels fragile, one really powerful way to threaten your opponents is to threaten disunion, right? Is to threaten civil war, to threaten secession. It's a really, and you can see throughout the particularly the 1840s and really the 1850s, you can see Southerners, first they sort of murmur about secession and disunion, and then by the 1850s, they're actually talking about plans of disunion. What's important to realize is that they're using that talk as a threat. They're using that talk as a way to push people into getting them to do what they want them to do. They're not necessarily at that point planning disunion, but intimidation, political intimidation, getting people to do what you want by making threats and talking big and suggesting you're going to do something drastic, that's what has power to it, right? And the tricky thing about that kind of power, I talk about this throughout the book, like threats and intimidation are very strategic and useful, because as long as people believe the threat might come true, and in the case of violence in Congress, you only need to have a few violent incidents for people to truly believe that they themselves might then be the victim of the next violent incident. You don't have to consistently do the bad act, you just have to have people believe that you can do the bad act. Threatening secession, they're not necessarily talking at that point using the phrase civil war. They are using the words disunion. That's a powerful threat. And you can see Benjamin Brown French, this dough-faced Democrat, for a while, really trying hard to appease the Southerners so that, they won't talk this drastic talk. And the democracy, the Democratic Party needs to hold things together. So I want to come back to that idea now. If in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, there's kind of an assumption that fellow feeling and good faith hold the Union together, and there's an assumption that political parties, national political parties, can help hold the Union together, which is what my buddy Benjamin Brown French thought. Where does that leave us now? Okay, so and this is where I was like, okay, well, I'm going to talk about the subject today. Let me Google, what's the talk out there about will there be a civil war? And I have to say that reporters were asking me if we're headed into a civil war years ago. The BBC, I did a BBC interview, and they wanted me to say that. They really wanted me, Joanne Freeman, Yale historian, says the nation's headed into civil war. And I think, and when I wouldn't say that, the reporter tried to prompt me by saying, well, so you would say America's sort of in a civil war without the weapons. First of all, we've got the weapons. I said, no, that's not what I'm saying. And just because you said it doesn't mean I'm going to say it. I'm not saying that. But so that kind of talk has been around forever. And again, it's a powerful, effective, threatening kind of a talk. So are we headed into a civil war? My short answer is going to be no, for a number of reasons. That said, and I'll find my way back to this at the end, there are so many unpredictable aspects of our current political situation that I'm going to say no, and I truly believe the answer is no. And I also believe that I can't 100% predict almost anything nowadays. However, I don't think we're headed into a civil war for any number of reasons. And first, most obviously, there isn't a sectional dimension to what we're seeing now, right? So disunion in a sense, is easier, even though it's hard, if you can draw a line across the nation and basically have one part of this war on one side of it and the other part of this war on the other side of it. There aren't any clean breaks, and we can talk about today, and you can talk about red states and blue states, but no state is entirely red or entirely blue. Our population is mixed. That sort of simple equation of civil warfare just doesn't exist. However, I do think that tossing around threats of civil war, they have an impact because it's the specter of people believing that this thing they take for granted, the Union, might be wounded, might be damaged. And that's a jarring thought in a way, in a sense, in the early period that I just talked about, the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, it terrified them, but they believed it could happen at any given moment. We're certainly not in that frame of mind. So some of what we're seeing now is extreme talk meant to be threatening and to get action, not necessarily to be acted on by the people making the threats, right? So anyone sort of talking violently right now, in part, is doing it for the impact and not necessarily planning to act on it. Although again, I think words matter. I told you I would circle back to this. Words do matter. And we do need, as always, and as I say repeatedly here, we need to watch and listen to the words. We need to think about why people are uttering these words. If they're getting you worked up, probably that's the goal of the person uttering those words. So think about what that means and how you then should hear them. So I do think we're in this moment where, because of the extreme polarization, because of the tendency of people, some people, to see some other Americans as basically not fellow Americans, but just as evil. Violence talk is easier for people, and threatening the Union is convenient, or threatening civil war, or threatening violence. And that's something that I think falls into a different category, because I think threatening violence and acting violent, sadly, is far easier and far more personal and requires much less to operate as a threat and to be tossed around as something for an impact. So, I do not believe we're headed into a civil war. I just don't. I do think it will be easy for us to lapse into some degree of an increased amount of violence, because I do think people who are threatening secession or threatening, to like Texas or other states that, they haven't necessarily said we're leaving the Union, but they're making it clear that they're sort of standing up on their own against the national government in some way. Those states can play that card in a really effective way. And then we are put in the situation, either the disunion card or the violence card, of having to sort through what's being said, decide about its impact. And in a sense, that's where I want to land today. I've sort of meandered all over the place in my comments. And I started out by saying, let's get beyond the word union and think about how people understood it over time. And it started out being fragile, and then people thought it was going to collapse, and it was this wonderful, glorious thing that could fall apart, and now we take it for granted. I want us to circle back around to people who are threatening disunion or just civil violence, meaning not civility violence, but between the American people violence. And I suppose I'll say what I have said before, which is, those are serious threats. That's why people are saying them. They're not to be ignored. Words matter. Words have an impact. As a matter of fact, that's some of what happens in the late 1850s, is people stand up on the floor of Congress, members of Congress stand up on the floor of Congress and say to each other, watch your words. Like, be careful of your words, because if you say the wrong words, this room will erupt in bloodshed, and then the Union probably will fall apart. So watch your words. We're in a moment where we need to watch words and think about words, where we need to remember that we live under the rule of law. I'm not saying this to be alarmist. I'm actually saying this quite the opposite, that sometimes words are words, and we need to recognize that fact and think about why people are using those words and the impact that they want to have and what that suggests. So we take the Union for granted, or I think we have, to some degree. we can continue on in that vein. However, I think we're in a moment where we shouldn't take anything for granted. We truly shouldn't, including democracy. I said that 100 times too, and I'll say that again now. We've taken a lot for granted through part of the 20th century. And some of what modern times is teaching us is that you shouldn't take things for granted. You need to stand up to preserve democracy, to preserve the nation as a nation of glorious, all of the glorious parts, a diverse nation, that there needs to be awareness and there needs to be action. So this is my comments today are part of this larger message that, you need to be aware and you need to be working for something. Don't take things for granted. But again, maybe more than anything else, my comments this morning can help you sort of tune your ears to hear what some of these threats are and think about why they're being uttered, and the impact that they're people uttering these threats, either of violence or secession or whatever. Why are they saying those words? What is it they want? And what does that mean about our understanding of the Union? I'm going to stop there and open things up exactly at 10:30 and open things up. Oh, Tom yelled for mug, beat Kara Lee to the mug question. Okay, I'm going to show you the mug, which you're going to have to believe me is the mug that I'm going to say it is, which I'll explain when I hold it up. Okay, I'm going to have to explain it. It relates to secession. So this mug says, Hamilton fired first. It's the mug that Matt and NCHE people sent me, that when you put hot coffee in it, you can tell my coffee is now cold. The message appears, it says Hamilton fired first, and there's an image of the duel on the other side. It's just darkness. It's kind of foreboding. But obviously the reason I picked this mug is because Hamilton's last letter, don't allow disunion, don't allow disunion. And some people said, and not really with much basis, that he fought the duel to defend the Union. I don't think really that was there, but the fact that some people thought that makes me seem so on target. Using this mug, and you're just gonna, Matt, you can attest to the fact that it says Hamilton fired first, NCHE on it.
It does. It's one of my favorite mugs.
It's fine. This is the first time I'm using it.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad you finally got it.
I did.
It took us forever to get you one.
It did, and then I loved it, and then somehow I think because it's black, I kept forgetting. And today I was like, what mug says disunion? Okay, now the second half of our equation here.
Yes.
Background.
I saw one guess for Appomattox, which is a great guess, but not it. This is the so-called Star-Spangled Banner house. Mary Young Pickersgill's home, where she sewed the Star-Spangled Banner that flew over Fort McHenry.
Wow. Oh, say can you see?
Oh, say can you see?
Creation of the national anthem. Okay, well that's good, because it's not obvious.
Nope.
But it's on target. I appreciate this.
Yeah.
And it's not IKEA.
And it's not IKEA, although now I'm thinking, gosh,
is that an IKEA? Because it looks like it.
No, I think, and I've never been here. And
is that actually a flag?
Well, yeah, I think it's a gigantic American flag.
That's okay. The fact that looks like an IKEA and it's a flag, that's like horribly symbolic in some way, and I'm just going to stop talking about it.
Okay. Well, we have 7 questions.
Okay.
Do I hear 8? Do I hear 8? 8 questions? No. First question from Dale. Do you think that over the past several decades, the country has moved back to the early years of the country, quote unquote, being quote unquote my state over the country as a whole? So in other words, are we moving back towards this idea of states being more important than the country as a whole?
I don't think, this is going to be an obvious thing to say. I don't think that's new. I think there have always been. I think that's just an ongoing thread of American history, is people who believe the states are more important than the national government, and people who think the national government deserves to have more power over the states. And obviously that ebbs and flows over time, so it's not sort of consistent. But it's I always talk about federalism, which allows that to sort of be hovering in American history, amorphous and constant. Federalism was the brilliant idea that allowed the national government to form precisely because it's grounded on that ambiguity, right? People were terrified of a national something. And a way for people to sign on to the national government was to say, oh, okay, there is a national something, but your states still matter. And federalism allows you to have double sovereignty, in a sense, to your state, to the national government. So that allowed for the creation of the Union, and that ambiguity tears at it again and again and again, because people grab at it when they feel threatened or they want what they want and they think it's not happening. States' rights, national government, but particularly states' rights are a way to sort of shake your fist at the national government. So that's pretty consistent over time, I would say.
Tim Johnson, one of our two Tims, says, in terms of threats.
Before Tim, I want to comment on a comment.
Oh, yes, please do.
Said, because it reminded me of something. So Gina said when states were left to fend for themselves in early COVID months, it accelerated or amplified identification with states over country. So that was a moment when I think on Twitter said, I will never teach the Articles of Confederation the same way ever again, because what we were watching was sort of states on their own, the national government not stepping in. And I was sort of seeing the outcome of that with no national center and states just sort of doing their own thing. And although I have, it doesn't change how I have understood the Articles of Confederation, but experiencing that was really interesting. So that is worth mentioning, that COVID in a variety of ways has been highlighting the ambiguities of federalism. Okay, now back to the question.
Before I do, Jeannie, if you could throw that in question Q&A, that would be great. I appreciate that. That's a good question. The one I saw fly through chat there. Tim's question is, in terms of threats and intimidation, when did many of the rules of the House or Senate come to be? Not just the filibuster, but things like holds and other blocking tactics we might think of as arcane today, and which prevent legislation and nominations.
Well, the rules, congressional rules are sort of a, not surprisingly, real mix of things. So some of them date all the way back and really are sort of, Robert's Rules of Order, like how you deal with assemblies. Others are created over time, or created and disassembled and not disassembled in full, and then have weird outcomes. The filibuster wasn't created as, we shall now create a tool that will allow people to hold up legislation, but that ended up being the way it was used. So, when you look broadly over sort of congressional rules over time, often they're reactive to a situation, either a situation that people feel is going the wrong way or that they're afraid will happen, but it's piecemeal. And rules can go in addition to coming, and there's a reason why at the beginning of sessions very often the rules are discussed, because, and this question highlights that fact, they're important because they shape the working of Congress on such a granular, such a basic level that they shape everything that Congress does. But I would say more than anything, they're reactive and can change over time more quickly perhaps than some other kinds of things can, because at the beginning of a congressional session, this is particularly true in the House since the Senate has longer terms, they're debated. A great example of this is the gag rule, which is introduced as a gag resolution for a while, meaning at the end of a congressional session, it lapses until it's made a gag rule, which means it's just there forever. And that's very much tied to that particular moment. We're now in a moment when the filibuster obviously is at the heart of a lot of debate. It deserves to be. It drives me up a tree when people say, our founders created the filibuster. Yeah, they did. They didn't. It's a practice that came out of other rules. Mm-hmm. So it's not this founder given tool that, heaven forbid, the sacrilege of attacking the filibuster. No,
it came out of a loophole.
Pardon?
Right. It came out of a loophole.
Yes. essentially it came out of a loophole. So the rules matter a lot, and they change a lot over time. And they can shape, some of what I talk about in my last book are ways in which when something would go dramatically wrong in Congress, people would always jump to their feet and say, the rules, we must attend to the rules. John Quincy Adams called those moments lamentation speeches. Like some congressman would beat another congressman with a cane, and then everyone would stand up and say, the rules, the rules. And Adams in his diary would say, the lamentation speeches have begun. Like this, what does this say about Congress? So I suppose, again, I'm sort of pointing to longer term ebbings and flowings more than things that happen to be immediate to this moment.
Another great Dale question, which is thinking of the early years of the Union, were the states ever really equal? In the early years of the Union, were the states ever really equal?
They had to believe they were within the Union, I think. And that's what you see certainly in Congress, where members of Congress believed that they were sort of the embodiment of what they represented, their state, their constituents, and after a while, their region. When they were treated badly, they would stand up and say, how dare you treat Ohio that way? So, when I said that the certain amount of faith and trust is at the base of the Union, I think that was true in a very literal way. And when states or sections of the country felt that they were not being treated equally, that's when you get people murmuring about secession, right? So the Federalists do that a little bit in 1804. During the War of 1812, there's the Hartford Convention where people are wondering, is that what they're doing? Are they seceding? Both of those moments happen because New England feels that the government doesn't care at all about New England and that it's ruled by Southerners, and now the Western states are going to join and they're going to go along with the South, and New England won't mean anything. So now we're going to, threaten. So I don't know if that absolutely answers your question.
No, I think it's an excellent point. Before I go any further, Steve was hoping, I'm going to, folks, Joanne was talking about a letter at the beginning of the talk.
Oh, wait, again, I just see, okay, I'm sorry, James Windle, I meant to say this right when I started. So in chat, James Windle has offered a link to Jefferson's Manual and Rules of the House. And that was the original rule book. I write a little bit about this in my last book, but the reason I mentioned this is because this idea to talk about the Union was James's idea. Yes. I wanted to give him credit. He emailed me and said, what about the Union? We could talk about the Union. And I thought that would be really interesting. So James, you get credit for this. I'm glad that your name appeared in chat. I would have felt horrible if I hadn't given.
Hopefully everybody saw that we gave him a shout out for the topic on Twitter. So yeah, we're really, really grateful for it. And as always, if folks have ideas, feel free to send them our way, because Lord knows, we might get something before Thursday afternoon when Joanne are like, oh yeah, we have a show tomorrow.
Pretty much, and I think about it during the week, all week, but it's Thursday afternoon that I begin to panic.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you did talk about a letter at the beginning of your talk, and I was hoping somebody from our audience could put a.
You mean the Hamilton document?
I think that's what this person that Steve is referring to.
The lawyerly thing that he writes about what's going to happen with the Union. Is that what?
Yep, Carolee said it's already in there. So
okay. Yeah. It's the Founders Online database. So yeah, there's the last letter. Maybe that's what he actually is being referred to. His last letter is on there, and this other memo is on there as well. If those of you who do not know the Founders Online database, which is brought to you by the National Archives, it's pretty amazing to have a word searchable database of the papers of these sort of elite political figures, these founders. I was so excited when that began to exist, and there's a private version as well that you pay for and that has more bells and whistles, but either way, it's kind of amazing that exists. Carolee offers a link to Founders Online.
There it is. I come quickly.
Yeah.
So speaking of James, he does have a great question. So let's ask that now, which is, you seem to have circled back to last week's discussion on performance and posturing. Most of what we see today is performance and posturing. What were the moments prior to the Civil War when it became clear secession and disunion were imminent?
Really good question. And I love that. Look at that continuity of shows. It's true that some of what I'm talking about in the mode of threats and intimidation is indeed posturing, performance, partly, playing to the folks back home. I think I talked last week about bunkum speeches, which are made particularly to have an impact out in the world and aren't really even spoken to members of Congress at all. Some of this is performative. Read me the precise question though, because I want to answer the precise question rather than happily burbling on about performance.
I have to find it again. There it is.
Yeah.
Most of what we see today is performance and posturing. What were the moments prior to the Civil War when it became clear secession and disunion were imminent?
Okay, I knew there was a second half of this question. I would say, there are a number of moments. I would say one sort of dramatic moment is in the late 1850s when you have the birth of the Republican Party. It's basically a sectional party. It's a Northern party, a Northern anti-slavery party for the most part. And as I have talked about elsewhere, some Republicans are elected to Congress explicitly to fight the slave power. And for some of them, that means fight. So certainly once people in Congress assume that bloodshed might erupt on the floor with two sides sort of fighting that way, you begin to get more talk in Congress about this being different than it was before, this looking different from how it looked before, because it feels to them, and they sometimes use this word, though not meaning it in a direct kind of a way, this looks like warfare. This looks like warfare, right? One side versus another side, and a lot of people on each side happen to be armed. That the appearance of that, for a bunch of obvious reasons, suggests to people that things are moving beyond the beyond. And there are fascinating letters. And there's a lot happening behind the scenes too, that leads people to realize things are going to a place where they weren't before. And what just popped into my head, this sort of fascinating letter I found, is by the wife of a South Carolina congressman. I can't remember her first name. I want to say like Amelia, but at any rate, Lawrence Kit, it's his wife. And she writes a letter to either a friend or her sister in the late 1850s. I'm going to get it wrong, so I'm not going to say it. The late 1850s. And she says, my husband was just here with a group of congressmen. They're all Southerners. And they claim that they're going to go to the House and take the speakership back from the Northerner who was given the speakership, and they're armed, like they have knives. And I don't know what to do. Right? This letter I found in North Carolina at Duke, I believe, this letter from this woman saying, there was just a group of armed congressmen here who say they're going to go take the speakership and they're going to go to Congress and do this, right? And I remember that letter partly. I remember all letters because I have the weird letter brain. But that particular one I remember because you feel for her, because she literally is saying to the person she's writing to, I don't know what to do. What do I do? And it's that immediacy that leads people to stand up in Congress in 1858, 1859, 1860 and say, please be careful of the words that leave your mouth, because now we're in a state of affairs that like warfare will erupt in the House of Representatives. It didn't feel that way before. And that partly has to do with the birth of a Northern anti-slavery party and the way that really changes the dynamics in Congress. And when that's happening in Congress, this gets back to the performative point, and being amplified by the press, which in this period is becoming more nationalized and spreading things more quickly than ever before, the nation sees that and draws conclusions, and things are happening on a local level in line with what they're seeing in Congress. So you can see how there's like a spiral of feeling, of sentiment that pushes things in a direction that they might not have otherwise gone, or not as quickly anyway.
So Jeannie asked this question earlier through chat, and so I asked her to put it in here because I think it's an interesting one. Again, we don't talk about foreign relations too often in here, but I think this is a good one. The federalism versus states' rights issue, or excuse me, does the federalism versus states' rights issue make us difficult to comprehend from overseas? In other words, what is sort of the attitudes about this huge federalism versus states' rights issue that dominates our social discourse?
That's actually a really good question. But what I'm searching for and might not have in my brain at this particular moment is a specific instance of feedback from a foreign nation on the complications of American federalism.
Yeah.
My gut answer would be that there are definitely going to be comments on what it does and how it has an impact on the United States, but I don't have that at my disposal. So I must not have ever seen a letter. Otherwise, I would have stayed in my brain. But it's a good question.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question too, and I agree. My gut is there has to be something there, but and the reason I wanted to ask it is because it's especially in this period of time when you start seeing monarchies fall and parliamentary governments in Europe start to emerge over the several centuries. Yeah, I often wonder about that, and how do they view the United States in that light? So it's a great question. I wish we had a better answer, but maybe for a future show. Right?
It's really interesting to go and look at the debates of the Constitutional Convention and see them wrestling with the idea of federalism, small f federalism. Can you have be sovereign to essentially two states at the same time? Can you be sovereign to things on a national level and on a state level? And at the time, that's a different kind of a question, because the assumption is, well, of course, everyone is sovereign to their state, which when states were colonies, they felt like a kind of nation state to you, even though you were part of the British Empire. So, someone like Hamilton, who beams onto the scene and comes from, the Caribbean and becomes a New Yorker, but has no great tie to any particular state. He's a person. So if we're going back to the question, like, what do foreigners think? Someone like Hamilton is like, God, the people here are so attached to their states and it's working against the working of the country. We have to find a way to get over that. So that's the direction that things are in the beginning, is states' rights. Individual states are the assumed power, and the challenge is to get people to look to the national government as a source of authority. It's part of what Hamilton tries to do with his financial plan.
Yeah,
is steer things so that people have to look to the national government for reimbursement for war debts and a variety of other things.
So I'm going to go off script here for just one second, because one of the things that I loved that you talked about earlier is how the folks in the founding era viewed the concept of union as a verb and not a noun. And so I was wondering, can you help us think through, because your point about Hamilton, I think is a good one. And we know that the Revolutionary War was pretty contingent in terms of support across the entire country, right? So what are some strategies that they used, or can you talk about some strategies that were used by folks who wanted to see union as a noun entering into the Revolutionary War? Yeah. Like how did they get people that were very committed to their states commit to this idea of a union in order to access freedom from England?
Well, I think initially they were responding to what they felt were unjust demands on the part of the crown, and the fact that their petitions and complaints didn't seem to be heard in any way. So initially, I don't think they're like, let's get together and fight a revolution because we want a union. I think it was, our rights are being taken away. a variety of things are happening here that are improper, that are unfair, and we need to do something to protect our rights, to defend ourselves. So I think Americans at the time felt goaded into what becomes the revolution. During the revolution is when they create the Articles of Confederation. So part of the answer to your question is, how do they create a union? Well, they kind of create a really wimpy one.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's worth going and finding the Articles of Confederation and reading them. They're minimal. They're absolutely minimal.
It's like dipping your toe into democracy.
Or certainly dipping your toe into nationalism, right? It's like, well, basically the states do everything. But if there's going to be a war declared, pretty much that needs to be something that happens on a higher level. But the national government can't make the states do things, right? The states have to kind of agree. So, you know, that's the first attempt at union. And I actually want to make the point, when I teach this, I always say that the Articles of Confederation get kind of a bum rap, because it's like, what a joke of a government, you know, what a silly government. Why did they even do that? And the point is, it's a perfectly logical government for people who are breaking away from a monarchy, from a centralized power, you know, from a monarchical government where power is absolutely centralized at the core. Of course, they're going to create something that in their mind is avoiding that threat. So it's not a joke government. It's a perfectly logical government. It doesn't necessarily work really well once it starts going, but it shouldn't be seen necessarily as the sort of doofus training wheels government. At that moment, it made perfect sense. But then it's its failures in the 1780s that leads to the Constitutional Convention after that.
Wow, that's perfect. That part of the reason I'm asking that is Kathleen's question here, which is that could you explain how nationalism might be hijacking our sense of union? And I think that conversation you just had is a good sort of segue into that.
How nationalism is
maybe hijacking our sense of union. So in other words, this idea of union as a noun.
Well, you know, I actually don't think we think about union very much, which is part of why, you know, when James suggested this, I thought it fascinated me, because one of the first things I sort of felt, you know, I was writing about what I end up calling in my last book, the emotional logic of disunion. That was my phrase. One of the first things I felt really deeply was the union as this emotional bond, that they made songs about it and they wrote poetry about it, and it was a different entity from what we have today. Truly, it was which is why I said I think it's an act. It's not a noun. It's a verb. It had a different assumption or different meaning to it, and I think, you know, we have at this moment we kind of take national for granted. You know, we argue about what shape that should be and how much power it should have and any number of other parts of it. But the idea that, you know, there is a union, I think the reason why we don't use that word anymore is that we're no longer, you know, we're not thinking of it as a verb for sure. And as a noun, it's kind of boring, you know, why not say nation? Because that's how we think of things now, is as a united nation, right? United States.
I think we got time for one, maybe two more, depending on how fast these fly through. Dave A wants to know, what is the federal government's role with regard to voting in national elections?
What is the federal government's role
with regard to voting in national elections? So he refers to the president, the vice president, senators, members of the House, etc.
Well, the Constitution sets out some of the details for that, as to, you know, when elections happen and who's can run for office, et cetera, et cetera. So some of that is constitutional, and some of that over time has been decided. And Newby has very strong views about voting rights and democracy always. So it makes perfect sense that he's piping up right now. Some of that has been decided over time. You can see the irregularities in that system when you look at early elections in the 1790s. And they happened in different times in different states, and they were carried out in different ways. And there was great variation in elections, in the basics of elections for a very long time. So that gets more into the category of something that evolves. Some of it is in the Constitution, and a big chunk of it has been developed over time.
So Dale is killing it with the questions today, so we're going to end with one last one with him, if that's all right.
Okay.
Is the Star Spangled Banner an example of thinking of union as a verb at a difficult time in our history?
Wow. Based on nothing except my immediate sort of mindset, the Star Spangled Banner appears to me to show more of a confederation than a union.
Ah, interesting.
It's individual states together in a circle, or at the time early on, it's individual states coming together in a nice little square. So I don't know if that represents union. It comes to represent the United States, but even the name of our country has within it that ambiguity, right?
Yeah.
The United States. It's states that have decided to come together. The name of our country is moving in that union as a verb direction in and of itself.
Well, the reality is you can't have the noun without it being a verb first, you know. Right? I mean,
I guess so. I mean,
when you say it that way, it's like what you just said made me think of that. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah,
the ambiguity is there.
The United States. So yeah, it's a good question and a good point, because I think that's another thing that we never think about, which is just the simple phrase United States, and what it's stating, what it has to be stated. It's states that are united. That's us. So yeah, federalism and union are, over American history, fascinating to look at how they evolve. I want to be sure I get, there's a book, I see it here. I just wanted to be sure I got the details right. Liz Varon, Varon, wrote a great book that I used in writing my most recent one, called Disunion. But what she does is really trace over time how the idea of disunion evolves and is used as a political tool, and it's very readable. It really does sort of, in some ways it's a sort of Road to the Civil War book, but it specifically looks at the idea of union and the word union and disunion, and how that plays out, and what that looks like on the way to Civil War. So I recommend that too. Okay, now
we are out of time. Before I give my usual spiel here, I do want to get serious for just one quick second. I want to encourage all of everybody out there to please stay safe. Yesterday, I lost a friend and colleague from graduate school, a tremendous scholar and one of the kindest human beings you'll ever meet, David Davenport, to COVID. So please stay safe out there and take care of each other. We all have way too much to contribute. And it's just a reminder that we need to take care of each other out there. So
I'm I'm sorry, and I appreciate you sharing that with this community, because it's important to know on a bunch of levels. But I'm really sorry.
Little bit of a shock. I haven't talked to David in a few years. Last saw him at a conference down in East Lansing, I think. So, but at any rate, on a happier note, I know that's an awkward segue into something called the after party, but let me just simply say thank you, everybody, for coming today. And thank you for all of your contributions today. And as always, if you like what we're doing here, please join us at www.ncheteach.org. Find out lots of great content, and we really, really appreciate your support.
And as always, I need to pipe in.
Yes, please do.
Thank you all for coming again for another week of this kind of conversation. And as I sometimes say, thank you for engaging in democracy on a Friday morning. This kind of conversation about the essentials of our national system of government and the things that surround it is vitally important. We need to understand them. We need to be thinking about them. We need to not be taking them for granted. And these kinds of conversations are part of what will help us get there. Now, as far as the after party is concerned, if there is anyone new, here's what will happen next. We will stop recording our conversation and we will segue into the after party, which is a less formal, chattier, friendlier sort of community conversation. If you beamed in here online through the NCHE website, just stay right here. And as I always say, poof, it will become the after party. If you are beaming in from Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and go to the NCHE website to get in. The NCHE link to the after party is ncheteach.org/conversations. And on that note, those of you who are leaving, I will see you next week. As Matt said, stay safe. And others, I'm sticking around and we can see what we decide to talk about.
And here comes the voice.
The voice.